Hello, in this video we're going to be discussing the concept of homeostasis and feedback control, one of the core concepts to any physiology class. Homeostasis is going to be defined as a dynamic consistency of an internal environment. In our body we have any number of variables that are able to fluctuate slightly to meet metabolic demands, but at the same time we have checks and balances in place that if those variables get too far outside the norm, we rein them in and we bring them back to normal. We see different examples of variables that are under homeostatic control. We have blood pH getting regulated by buffers in the blood, the respiratory system, and the renal system. We have blood pressure getting regulated, still able to increase and decrease based on metabolic demand, but still held in check by various manipulations of blood vessel dilation and constriction and heart constriction strength. We see blood glucose levels get regulated in a narrow range based on the actions of insulin, for example, if blood glucose gets too high. And we have the classic example of body temperature being regulated at the standard 98.6. Body temperature gets too high, we see sweat glands become activated, we see blood vessels close to the surface of the skin dilate. If it gets too cold, we see skeletal muscle invoke a shivering response. We see blood vessels again constrict in the extremities. It's time to conserve heat. So we see all of these variables able to change slightly, but if they meet a certain threshold of change, we bring about organ systems that can counter those changes. Homeostasis can be affected by any stress to both the internal and external environment. Again, get back to body temperature. If we put you in a cold or really hot environment externally, you will have these changes to homeostasis internally that needs to be corrected for. We can see changes to blood sugar if you eat a meal. More of an internal change, but still something that's an increased stress at that time that needs to be countered and corrected. We maintain homeostasis of all of these variables by varying negative and positive feedback loops, with negative being the overwhelming, prominent feedback system. Regardless of which one's more common, though, both of them, positive and negative, are going to have these three generic components. We see them each have a receptor component, always detecting the state of the body at any given time, relaying those informations that are gathered and passed along to the control center. It's the control center that determines if the information it's received needs to be acted upon or not. And if we exceed the thresholds of change in any variable, it's the control center that will recruit any number of effector organs that are going to be suitable to correcting that specific change. When we look at negative feedback, any deviation too high or too low of the norm gets brought back to the midline. Think of the way a thermostat would regulate temperature in a room. You may set the thermostat to 70. That doesn't mean the ambient temperature in the room is always going to be dead on 70. You will see a fluctuation of temperature around that thermostatic setting. Temperature gets too high, maybe an air conditioner kicks in as an effector organ to bring that temperature back down to that set state. If the temperature gets too low, maybe this time the heating unit kicks in to bring that temperature back up again to that same preset average state. So regardless if we deviated above or below normal room temperature, there is a negative feedback mechanism to counter that degree of change and bring it back to where it should be. Sensor, control center, and effector as a continuous correcting and recorrecting state. In a positive feedback loop, we're not looking to counter the sense change. In a positive feedback loop, we actually take that initial deviation from the norm and reinforce it into an even bigger change. Now that sounds very strange, but that's really why positive feedback in the human body is quite rare. There's actually only one classic example of positive feedback control in the human body, and that's going to be the birthing process. This time, we get the baby's head pushing against the inside of the cervix, creating a little bit of stretch that's detected in that tissues. But rather than correct that change, it's going to bring about a stronger uterine contraction to push the baby's head into the cervix even harder, causing an even greater degree of stretch. Increased stretch, stronger contraction, which causes even more stretch, which causes an even stronger contraction until eventually the cervix can no longer contain the baby and you get a delivery. But in this case, the end result is still a restoration of the mother back to the pre-pregnancy state. It's still a homeostatic mechanism to restore the normal state of the body. So we start with a small change, and we take that small change and we magnify it. We amplify that change up until eventually the end result is still a restoration of body function. So we look at it in a flow chart type of schematic. We see the stressor cause changes that are detected by the receptor. That information is constantly being passed onto a control center. And if those changes are outside of the thresholds of norm, then we are going to see the control center recruit effector organs that will come back and counter our original stressor. We see the example of increased blood pressure. That's going to be detected by baroreceptors in the blood vessels, pass along to centers in the brain stem. Those centers, if that blood pressure is outside of normal limits, is going to recruit heart contraction strength. It's going to recruit blood vessel dilation, all in an attempt to bring blood pressure back down. So blood pressure was elevated. We recruited the proper effector organs to bring it back down to where it should be. Positive or negative feedback. It's going to be negative. We initially had an increase change. We countered it and brought it back down. Negative feedback control. If we look at the example of blood sugar decreasing, we will see those changes get detected by chemoreceptors in the blood vessel. Information is passed along to central nervous system centers that act as a control center. From there, if the deviation is great enough from the norm, we recruit the appropriate effector organs. In this case, it's going to be the pancreas cells that produce glucagon, a hormone that will help get stored sugar as glycogen in the liver and released into the blood, raising blood sugar back up. Initially, blood sugar dropped. Our cascade of events led us to a solution where we brought blood sugar back up to where it should be. Is that a positive or negative feedback? Again, that's going to be an example of negative feedback as we countered the initial change. Now we see fetus reaching full development, pushing into the cervix, causing a stretch. Detected by central nervous system centers, we see oxytocin released from the posterior pituitary, which causes an increase in uterine muscle contraction strength, and as a result, baby pushes into the uterus even harder. Now, aside from the dead ringer giveaway that we saw the terms fetus and uterus in the same flow chart, that's the only example of positive that we had, right? But in this case, look at the mechanism. We still saw an increase in uterine strength contraction, reinforcing the initial stressor that got detected. So this is going to be an example of a positive feedback. I want to thank everybody for watching. Hope it helped.